Imagine this, you're 18 years old, back at your family home for the first time in 2 years, dreading the return of an annual camping trip. But what if the nightmares of that trip didn't stay in the past? What if they followed you home, haunting your every step, and whispering from the shadows? In tonight's chilling story, we delve into the darkest corners of fear and loss. An innocent camping trip with a beloved father turns into a nightmare of incomprehensible horror. As the father, a kind man battling his own demons, begins to exhibit eerie and unexplainable behavior, the trip takes a turn for the worse. A cliffside tragedy marks the end of the journey, but the terror doesn't end there. Back home, the line between reality and the supernatural blurs as the young man is tormented by haunting visions of his deceased father. He's confronted with an impossible choice and a chilling message that he can't escape. Join us as we explore the harrowing tale of grief, trauma, and the sinister presence that refuses to let go. Will the horrors of the past finally be laid to rest, or will they drag him back into a nightmare he can't escape? Stay with us until the end. The darkness has only just begun. Before starting the video, make sure you are subscribed to the channel so you can continue following our stories. It's been 2 years since that day, 2 long, agonizing years since I lost my dad in the most inexplicable way possible. Every time I close my eyes, I'm back there in the woods, reliving each moment, each sound, each haunting detail. I was 16 then, just a teenager, more concerned with my first serious relationship and trying to fit in at school than with these annual camping trips. But for Dad, these trips were sacred. They were his way of keeping us connected, of passing down something that had been a part of his life for as long as I could remember. It was mid-October, and the air had that crisp, biting quality that always signaled the start of our camping season. I'll never forget how excited Dad was that morning. He was always the first one up, moving with a sense of purpose that I could never quite match, especially at such an early hour. The sun hadn't even risen yet when he came into my room, his voice gruff but filled with a warmth that only he could manage. "Son, get up, get dressed, and let's get a move on." His words were like an alarm clock, jolting me from the comfort of my bed. My eyelids felt like they weighed a ton, and my body moved sluggishly, still caught in the grip of sleep. I mumbled something about being ready in 15 minutes, but it was a lie. I needed much more than that to gather myself, mentally and physically. As I threw on my clothes, I could hear the faint sounds of Dad moving around downstairs, the clink of gear being checked and double-checked, the occasional grunt as he lifted something heavy. When I finally made it downstairs, I found Mom in the kitchen, her eyes glued to the morning news, just like every other day. The familiar hum of the TV mixed with the scent of coffee brewing on the counter, creating a scene so ordinary that it almost felt surreal in hindsight. She didn't even look up when I walked in, just said, "Your dad said to send you out when you came down." I gave her a quick kiss on the cheek, a part of our usual routine, and told her I'd see her in a couple of days. Her eyes softened for a moment, and she pulled me into a hug, holding on just a little tighter than usual. "Stay safe, Tony. I love you," she said, and I repeated it back, not knowing it might be the last time we'd have such an exchange. Outside, Dad was in his element, checking the truck's engine, making sure everything was perfect. The cold morning air hit me as soon as I stepped out, a stark contrast to the warmth of the house. I could see my breath in the air, little puffs of mist that quickly dissipated. The sky was a deep indigo, with just a hint of dawn on the horizon. Everything felt normal, almost comforting, like we were stepping into another routine trip. Dad was getting the last bit of equipment packed when he called me over. "Son, come help me with this," he said, his voice tinged with that familiar no-nonsense tone. I tried to lighten the mood, teasing him as I walked over. "What's wrong, Pops? You getting too old for this?" He chuckled, a sound that always made me smile, but then his expression changed, just for a moment, a flicker of something I couldn't quite place. "I'll never be too old to whoop your ass," he joked back, but there was something else in his eyes, something that didn't match the laughter in his voice. And then he said it. "Tony, if anything ever happens, son, never go camping again." His words hung in the air, heavy and cryptic, sending a chill down my spine that had nothing to do with the cold. I laughed it off, asking what he meant, but he just shook his head and went back to packing. It was so unlike him to say something like that, so out of place that it stuck with me, gnawing at the back of my mind even as I tried to push it away. Looking back now, I realized that was the first sign, the first crack in the facade of normalcy. But at the time, I didn't give it the attention it deserved. I should have. Maybe if I had, things would have turned out differently. We finally loaded up the truck, the sky now tinged with the pale light of early morning. The drive was long, 4 hours into the middle of nowhere, deep into the heart of California's wilderness. It was a route we had taken so many times before that I could almost predict every twist and turn in the road. But this time, the journey felt different. Dad was quiet, more so than usual, his eyes focused on the road, but his mind seemed elsewhere. Every now and then, he would ask me a question, trying to engage me in conversation. "So, kiddo, you ready for this year's trip?" he asked, glancing over at me with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. I forced a smile back, lying through my teeth. "Of course, I am, Pops," I said, even though part of me was already wishing I could be anywhere else. I was 16, after all. I had other things on my mind, a girlfriend, friends, the usual teenage stuff. But I knew how much these trips meant to him, how much they meant to us, so I kept my mouth shut and played along. The landscape outside the truck window slowly transformed from the familiar suburban sprawl to towering trees and winding mountain roads. The higher we climbed, the more isolated we became, until it felt like we were the only two people left in the world. By the time we reached our campsite, the sun was high in the sky, casting long shadows through the dense forest. The spot we always chose was breathtaking, a small clearing perched on the edge of a cliff, with a view that stretched out for miles. Below us, the river roared with a ferocity that made the ground tremble, its white water crashing against the rocks like nature's own heartbeat. As I started unloading the truck, I noticed Dad wasn't helping like he usually did. Instead, he was pacing, his eyes darting from tree to tree, as if he was expecting something, or someone, to emerge from the woods. His muttering was low, almost inaudible, but I could catch bits and pieces of what he was saying. It didn't make any sense, just fragmented sentences and half-formed thoughts that seemed to be aimed at no one in particular. "This is the last time, can't let it happen again, not again." I tried to shake off the growing unease that was starting to settle in my chest. Dad had always been a bit distant, ever since he came back from the war. Mom used to say that while he came home in body, part of his mind was still out there, fighting battles in the dead of night. I had seen it myself, the nights when he would wake up screaming, drenched in sweat, with eyes that seemed to be looking right through me. Mom would always be there to calm him down, whispering soothing words until he fell back into an uneasy sleep. But this was different. There was something darker at play, something that I couldn't quite grasp but felt deep in my gut. We spent the next hour or so setting up camp, with Dad finally snapping out of whatever trance he'd been in and helping me. The tension seemed to ease as the sun began to set, casting the forest in a warm, golden light that made everything look almost magical. By the time we finished, it was around 3 p.m., and our stomachs were growling in unison. "Let's get down to that river and catch us some dinner," Dad said, his voice steady again, as if nothing had happened. I nodded, eager to do something that felt normal, something that could shake off the weird vibe that had been hanging over us all day. The hike down to the river took about 5 minutes, the path winding through dense underbrush until it opened up to the water's edge. The river was a force of nature, a churning mass of white water that roared louder than anything I'd ever heard. You could feel it in your chest, a constant, pounding rhythm that made the ground tremble beneath our feet. But it was beautiful, too, raw and untamed, like something out of a storybook. Dad led us down the riverbank to a spot where the water slowed, forming a small creek that trickled into the main flow. He explained how this was the perfect spot for catching fish, but as he was speaking, his voice trailed off. I looked over at him and saw that he had gone completely still, his eyes fixed on something deep in the woods. His lips were moving, but the words were too soft for me to catch. It was like he was in a trance, his face twisted in an expression I had never seen before, fear. I stepped closer, my heart pounding in my chest. "Dad, are you okay?" I asked, my voice trembling despite my efforts to stay calm. He didn't respond, didn't even acknowledge that I was there. His eyes were glazed over, staring into the dark forest as if something was staring back. I followed his gaze, but all I saw were trees, their branches swaying gently in the breeze. I reached out, my hand trembling as it hovered over his shoulder. "Dad?" I whispered, the word barely escaping my lips. My hand hovered over his shoulder, my fingers trembling as they finally made contact. His body jerked as if I had shocked him, and he snapped out of whatever trance had taken hold of him. He turned to me, his eyes wide and wild, like a man who had just seen something he couldn't comprehend. For a moment, I thought he might lash out or yell at me for startling him, but instead, his face softened, and he let out a shaky breath. I'm sorry, Tony," he muttered, rubbing a hand over his face like he was trying to wipe away whatever thoughts had taken over. "I just thought I saw something." He forced a smile, but it was a poor attempt. His eyes still held that haunted look, a deep unease that wouldn't let go. I didn't press him on it, though I wanted to. Something told me it was better to let it go, at least for now. Instead, I just nodded, pretending to buy into his weak explanation, and turned my attention back to the river. The sound of the rushing water filled the silence between us, masking the tension that still lingered in the air. We spent the next hour fishing, though neither of us caught anything worth keeping. Dad was distracted, his eyes constantly darting back to the woods, while I found myself doing the same, my mind racing with all the possibilities of what he might have seen, or thought he saw. The forest suddenly felt less inviting, more oppressive, like the trees themselves were closing in on us. By the time we decided to head back to camp, the sun was starting to dip below the horizon, casting long, eerie shadows across the landscape. The temperature dropped rapidly, and a biting chill settled into the air. We walked in silence, the only sounds coming from the crunch of leaves underfoot and the distant roar of the river behind us. When we reached the campsite, the first thing Dad did was build a fire. He worked quickly, almost frantically, as if the darkness around us was something he needed to fight off. I sat nearby, watching him, my stomach knotting with unease. The fire finally roared to life, its warm glow pushing back the encroaching night. Dad sat down across from me, staring into the flames, his face illuminated by the flickering light. "You know, Tony," he started, his voice low and gravelly, "there's something about these woods, something I can't quite put my finger on. I've felt it for years, every time we've come out here. But this time it's different. It's stronger." He paused, taking a deep breath as if he was about to say something more, but then he shook his head and fell silent again. I wanted to ask him what he meant, to pry deeper into whatever was going on inside his head, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. There was something in his tone, something that told me I might not want to know the answer. Instead, I just nodded, trying to keep my voice steady. "Maybe we're just tired, Dad. It's been a long day." He looked up at me then, his eyes searching mine as if he was trying to decide whether or not to tell me something. But whatever it was, he chose to keep it to himself. He simply nodded and leaned back, resting against his pack. "Yeah, you're probably right. Just tired," he murmured, more to himself than to me. The night dragged on, each minute feeling like an eternity. We didn't talk much after that, just sat there in the cold, the fire crackling between us. I tried to shake off the creeping fear that was gnawing at the edges of my mind, but it was no use. Every rustle in the trees, every gust of wind sent a fresh wave of anxiety through me. I found myself glancing over at Dad more and more, watching for any sign that he was slipping back into that strange, haunted state. Eventually, he stood up and stretched, letting out a long sigh. "I'm turning in," he said, his voice weary. He patted my shoulder as he passed, giving me a faint smile. "Get some sleep, kiddo. We've got a big day tomorrow." I nodded, trying to return his smile, but it felt forced. I watched as he crawled into the tent, the flap falling shut behind him. The fire crackled on, the only source of light in the encroaching darkness. I stayed up a little longer, staring into the flames, my mind racing with thoughts I couldn't quite control. Finally, I decided to call it a night. The cold had seeped into my bones, and my eyelids were getting heavy. I doused the fire, watching as the last embers died out, and crawled into the tent beside Dad. He was already asleep, or at least I thought he was. His breathing was slow and even, his face calm and peaceful, a stark contrast to the man who had been so on edge just hours before. I lay there in the dark, listening to the sounds of the forest outside. The wind had picked up, howling through the trees, making the tent flap ripple. I tried to close my eyes, to block out the noise, but sleep wouldn't come. Something wasn't right. I could feel it deep in my gut, an instinctive sense of dread that I couldn't shake. And then I heard it, a faint rustling outside the tent, followed by the soft crunch of leaves. My heart leaped into my throat. I held my breath, straining to listen, hoping it was just the wind playing tricks on me. But the sound came again, closer this time, unmistakable. "Dad," I whispered, my voice barely audible in the stillness of the tent. I reached out, gently shaking his shoulder. "Dad, wake up. There's something outside." His eyes snapped open immediately, his body tense. He listened for a moment, his face going pale as he heard the noise too. Without a word, he motioned for me to stay quiet. He grabbed the flashlight from his pack and slowly unzipped the tent, just enough to peer outside. I could barely breathe, every muscle in my body locked in place as I waited. The flashlight beam cut through the darkness, but it revealed nothing, just the trees swaying in the wind, the shadows dancing along the forest floor. Dad scanned the area, his jaw clenched tight, but whatever was out there was either gone or had never been there in the first place. Finally, he pulled back into the tent, zipping it up tightly. He didn't say anything, just lay back down, his eyes fixed on the tent ceiling. I could tell he was still on edge, his body tense, ready to spring into action at any moment. I wanted to ask him what he thought it was, if he had seen anything, but the look on his face stopped me. Instead, I just lay there beside him, the fear still gnawing at me, keeping sleep at bay. The minutes ticked by, each one dragging slower than the last, until finally, exhaustion overtook me, and I drifted off into a restless sleep. But even in sleep, I couldn't escape the feeling that something was terribly, horribly wrong. The night was a shroud of darkness and cold silence. I lay there in my sleeping bag, my mind churning with worry and fear. The hours seemed to stretch endlessly. Every creak of the tent, every distant snap of a twig, set my heart racing. I tried to calm myself, to convince myself that it was just the remnants of the previous night's fears haunting me. Then, suddenly, I was jolted awake by a blood-curdling scream. It was the kind of scream that tore through the quiet night and made your bones chill. I shot up, my pulse pounding in my ears. My breath came in short, rapid bursts as I listened intently. The scream had come from outside, from where Dad's tent was pitched. Panic surged through me as I scrambled out of my sleeping bag, my feet fumbling with the tent zipper. The cold night air hit me like a wall as I stumbled outside. The moon was a pale sliver in the sky, casting long, eerie shadows that seemed to writhe and twist. The fire had died down to a few smoldering embers, barely illuminating the area. My eyes darted towards Dad's tent, where I could hear faint murmurs coming from within. "Dad?" I called out, my voice trembling as I approached the tent. I unzipped it slowly, peeking inside. The sight that met my eyes was like something from a nightmare. Dad was thrashing about in his sleeping bag, his face twisted in a grimace of fear and anguish. His mumbling had escalated into incoherent babbling, punctuated by occasional gasps and shivers. It was clear he was caught in some sort of nightmarish struggle. "Dad, wake up!" I pleaded, reaching out to touch his shoulder. He didn't seem to hear me, lost in whatever tormented his dreams. His body jerked violently, as though he was fighting something unseen. Suddenly, his voice changed. It became deeper, more guttural. "You can't have them, they're mine. I won't let you." I recoiled, my heart hammering in my chest. The voice was not his, something else was speaking through him. I stumbled back, feeling like the world was slipping away from me. "Dad!" I shouted again, but he remained unresponsive. I heard a low, menacing growl from somewhere within the tent. It was an unearthly sound that seemed to vibrate through my bones. I felt a cold sweat break out across my forehead. Just then, Dad's eyes snapped open. He looked at me, but there was something unsettling about his gaze, something hollow and vacant. The terror that had been in his voice moments before was gone, replaced by an eerie calm. "What's wrong, son?" he asked, his voice back to normal, but his expression remained distant. "I heard you screaming. What's happening?" I asked, trying to steady my voice. Dad shook his head, his eyes darkening. "I was just having a bad dream. Nothing to worry about." I wanted to press him further, but the way he looked at me made me hesitate. There was something in his eyes, a shadow of something I couldn't quite grasp. I nodded slowly, though my mind was still racing with fear and confusion. "Just try to get some sleep," I said, turning to leave the tent. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. As I walked back to my own tent, I glanced back at Dad's tent. He was already lying down again, but something about the way he lay there, so still and silent, sent chills down my spine. I crawled back into my tent, trying to block out the fear that was now a constant companion. Sleep came fitfully, filled with fragmented dreams of shadows and whispers. Every time I closed my eyes, I could still hear the growls and screams from earlier, echoing in the dark corners of my mind. When morning finally came, I emerged from my tent, bleary-eyed and exhausted. Dad was already up, moving around the campsite with a forced cheerfulness that seemed out of place. The previous night's events hung over me like a thick fog, but I tried to push them aside, focusing instead on the tasks of the day. We went about our routine, hiking, fishing, gathering wood. But the atmosphere was heavy, weighed down by an unspoken dread. Dad was more distant than usual, his interactions with me terse and clipped. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong, but I didn't know how to confront it. As the sun set and the temperature dropped, the anxiety returned. I couldn't shake the image of Dad's twisted, tormented face from the night before. I avoided looking at him directly, afraid of what I might see. Nightfall came, and with it, the creeping sense of dread that had been with me all day. I lay in my tent, the cold and silence amplifying every creak and rustle outside. I tried to convince myself that it was just the remnants of my fear, but deep down, I knew something was very wrong. Sleep eluded me, and I lay there, wide awake, listening to the forest sounds. Every so often, I thought I heard a whisper, something just out of reach, something that made my skin crawl. As the night wore on, I felt a growing unease. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that something was lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. The fear was almost unbearable, and I found myself wishing for morning to come quickly, hoping that the light of day would drive away the darkness that seemed to be closing in around us. But deep down, I knew that whatever was haunting us, whatever had taken hold of my father, was not something that would be easily banished. And as I lay there in the darkness, I could only hope that we would make it through the night without facing whatever terror was waiting just beyond the edge of the firelight. Morning arrived with a gray, overcast sky, offering no comfort. I woke to the persistent chill in the air, my body still tense from the anxiety of the previous night. The night had been long and restless, filled with whispers and unsettling dreams that left me feeling drained and on edge. Dad was already up, preparing breakfast with an efficiency that belied the fatigue I could see etched on his face. His movements were methodical, almost mechanical, and he offered no words of comfort or reassurances. The previous night's events seemed to weigh heavily on both of us, though he made no mention of it. We ate breakfast in silence, the usual camaraderie of our camping trips absent. The forest around us was eerily quiet, as if holding its breath in anticipation. I tried to focus on the tasks at hand, helping Dad with the fire, organizing the fishing gear, but my mind was elsewhere, plagued by the fear of what lay ahead. After breakfast, we set out on a hike through the dense forest. The trees loomed over us, their branches twisted into dark, gnarled shapes that seemed to reach out like skeletal fingers. The path was familiar, yet today it felt foreign and menacing. Every rustle in the underbrush, every snap of a twig underfoot, heightened my sense of dread. Dad's mood was more somber than usual. He walked ahead, his head bowed and his eyes scanning the surroundings with a concentration that bordered on paranoia. I tried to engage him in conversation, but he only offered short, clipped responses. The strain was evident, and I could tell he was struggling with something beyond my understanding. We reached a small clearing, a spot we had visited many times before. It was here that we would usually set up camp for the night. But today, it seemed different, darker, more oppressive. I noticed Dad eyeing the area with a mix of apprehension and resignation. He set about setting up camp with a hurried urgency, as if he was trying to complete a task before something could stop him. As the sun began to set, the shadows grew longer and more menacing. The familiar campsite felt alien, and the once comforting sounds of nature now seemed threatening. The fire crackled and popped, but the warmth it provided did little to dispel the cold feeling settling in my bones. Dinner was prepared and eaten in strained silence. The usual banter was missing, replaced by a heavy quiet that only deepened my anxiety. I tried to ignore the feeling of dread gnawing at me, focusing instead on the mundane tasks of cleaning up and preparing for the night. But the feeling that something was terribly wrong continued to gnaw at me, a constant reminder of the fear I could not escape. As darkness fell, I found myself once again lying in my tent, unable to shake the feeling that something was lurking just beyond the firelight. The forest outside was a black void, the sounds of the night magnified by the oppressive silence. I lay there, wide awake, my mind racing with the horrors of the previous night and the fear of what might come. Sleep finally claimed me, though it was restless and filled with nightmares. I dreamt of shadows moving in the dark, of whispers and growls that seemed to come from all directions. I awoke with a start, my heart pounding, convinced that I had heard something, or someone, moving outside my tent. The night seemed to drag on, each minute stretching into an eternity. I lay there, trembling, waiting for the dawn that seemed to be taking its sweet time arriving. Every sound outside the tent was amplified, every rustle and creak a potential threat. I could feel the fear tightening around me, squeezing the breath from my lungs. As the first light of dawn began to seep into the tent, I felt a wave of relief. The light of day had always been a comfort, a shield against the darkness. I emerged from the tent, feeling the cool morning air on my face, and looked around at the campsite. Everything seemed normal, yet the sense of foreboding remained. Dad was already up, packing away the gear with a grim determination. He didn't look at me, didn't speak. It was as if he was preparing for something that I could only guess at. I wanted to confront him, to ask him what was happening, but the words caught in my throat. The fear and confusion were too great. We finished packing and began the drive back home. The journey was a blur of anxiety and exhaustion. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting for us, something that we had not yet faced. The road stretched out before us, seemingly endless, and I stared out the window, my mind consumed by the events of the past few days. As we approached home, the familiar landmarks brought a sense of relief, though it was tempered by the lingering dread. I was desperate to escape the shadow of the forest, to leave behind the terror that had haunted us on this trip. The thought of facing another night in the forest was unbearable. We arrived home, and the normalcy of our surroundings felt like a lie, a cruel illusion that masked the horror we had just endured. I was exhausted, emotionally and physically drained, and I longed for a sense of safety and security. But deep down, I knew that the horror was not over, that whatever had followed us from the forest was not done with us yet. That night, as I lay in bed, the weight of the past few days pressed heavily on me. I tried to convince myself that the worst was over, that returning home would offer some respite from the terror of the forest. But as the hours dragged on, sleep refused to come, leaving me in a restless, anxious state. I tossed and turned, the echoes of the forest still fresh in my mind. The whispers, the shadows, and the haunting presence of my father seemed to linger in the corners of my room. I couldn't escape the feeling that something was watching me, waiting for the right moment to strike. Every creak of the house, every distant sound, was magnified into a potential threat. Around midnight, I heard a noise from downstairs, a soft, rhythmic tapping. My heart leaped into my throat. It was the same eerie, persistent sound that had haunted my dreams. I lay still, straining to listen, my mind racing with possibilities. Could it be an intruder? Or was it something else, something that defied explanation? I finally mustered the courage to get up and investigate. Quietly, I crept down the stairs, each step echoing in the silence. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, as I approached the living room. I reached for the light switch, but a sudden chill swept through the room, freezing me in place. The tapping stopped abruptly. I stood in the darkness, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. I felt as though I was being watched, my skin crawling with unease. Slowly, I turned on the light, revealing the empty living room. Nothing seemed out of place, but the sense of dread remained. Then I noticed it, a small wooden cross on the coffee table. It was the same cross my father had carved. I picked it up, feeling its weight in my hand, and a shiver ran down my spine. Had it always been there? I couldn't remember seeing it before. I held it tightly, searching for answers that eluded me. As I turned to head back upstairs, I heard a whispering voice, my father's voice, calling out from the darkness. "Son, it's time for the camping trip." The words sent a chill down my spine. I spun around, but there was no one there. The house was empty, the silence almost deafening. I raced back upstairs, my heart pounding in my chest. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was lurking just beyond my sight, something malevolent and relentless. I locked my bedroom door, but the sense of security was fleeting. The whispers continued, growing louder, more urgent. In the dead of night, I heard a sound that made my blood run cold, a scraping noise, like something being dragged across the floor. It came from just outside my door. I huddled in bed, my hands covering my ears, trying to block out the horrifying noise. The scraping continued, growing louder and more frantic. I dared not move, fearing what I might find if I ventured out of my room. I wanted to call for help, but the thought of making a sound in the dark seemed even more terrifying. The scraping finally stopped, replaced by an eerie silence that hung heavily in the air. Unable to endure the suspense any longer, I slowly cracked open the door. The hallway was dark and empty. I peeked out, expecting the worst. To my relief, nothing was out of place. The house was still and silent. But the terror remained, a constant presence in the back of my mind. As dawn approached, I finally managed to drift into a fitful sleep. When I woke, I was exhausted and on edge. The events of the night had left me shaken and fearful. I knew I had to confront whatever was haunting me, but I didn't know where to start. I spent the day trying to maintain a semblance of normalcy, but every creak of the house and every shadow seemed to mock my attempts at reassurance. I wanted to speak to my mother about what had happened, but I was unsure how to begin. She had seemed so detached and distant, almost resigned. That evening, I sat in the living room, clutching the wooden cross, my mind racing with thoughts of the forest and the ghostly presence of my father. The house was quiet, too quiet, and the darkness outside seemed to press in on me. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting, watching, and I was powerless to stop it. As night fell, I braced myself for whatever might come. I knew that the terror of the forest had followed me home, that the nightmare was far from over. The final encounter with my father had left a mark on my soul, and I was left with only one certainty: I would never go camping again. I held onto the wooden cross tightly, a tangible reminder of the horror I had endured and the promise I made to myself. The haunting memories of that fateful trip would stay with me forever, a constant reminder of the darkness that lurked just beyond the edge of the known world.